Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank Dr. Swapnesh and BOA for having me here. I'm going to be speaking about the various types of refractive surgery today. When a patient requiring spectacle independence walks into your OPD, there are a couple of things that you need to keep in your mind. The first of them would be, in my opinion, to gauge what your patient's expectations are versus what is the actual reason for them coming to you for a refractive surgery. So this needs to be emphasized because a lot of them will come to you at the last hour saying tomorrow or day after tomorrow is our pre-employment test, and now we have been told that we cannot use glasses, and so we want to come in for a surgery. In this situation, it's very important that you explain to the patient that even if you do perform the surgery, if everything is fine, all the parameters are okay, and you perform the surgery, the fact that the first day post-op outcome may not be as much as the pre-employment test requires is something that you need to explain to the patient. Secondly, there is more photosensitivity, there may be more dryness, because of which their visual outcome may be reduced, because of which again they need to be aware of that situation. Expectations need to be gauged because a lot of patients feel that once you have performed a surgery on them or refractive surgery, there's a sign and stamp and seal on it that nothing is going to happen to them for the rest of their lives. In fact, that's one of the reasons why LASIK used to be badmouthed in the earlier days, because people used to think that, oh, after 40 anyways we end up getting glasses. They don't realize that that is presbyopia, which is independent, and that needs to be explained to them that irrespective of whether you get the surgery done or not, you will get reading glasses after the age of 40. So it's important to sit and spend that chair time with them. After having done that, you can start with your preliminary evaluation. This should involve a good refraction as well as your intraocular pressure, after which you can do a detailed slit lamp evaluation. Always do a dry eye assessment, do a Schirmer test, assess the lid for any NGD, any corneal dystrophies, and particularly look at the lens, especially when it is fully dilated. You need to make sure that the zonules are intact, because in case you are planning, say for example, an ICL procedure, then you need to make sure that your lens is stable. Everyone must undergo a dilated retina evaluation. There is no two ways about that. Along with that, you can do a dilated refraction, which should correspond to your undilated refraction, so that you are doubly sure of what the patient's acceptance is. And a fundus peripheral examination with IO and indentation. Pre-LASIK evaluation, of course, will require a topography as well as a pachymetry, which are not going to be discussed because of the want of time and focus on refractive surgery in this presentation. So refractive surgery broadly is divided into cornea-based surgeries and lens-based surgeries, where cornea-based surgeries are further divided into PRK, LASIK, and SMILE. As we all know, LASIK has two types, microkeratome as well as femtosectomy. And lens-based surgeries are divided into further two types, the phakic lens and clear lens extraction. So the corneal refractive surgery by itself has evolved massively over the years. It began with radial keratotomy, and I'm going to be brushing up on this as well in the current presentation, for the reason that a lot of us will get to see patients with complications of RK or RK done many years back, and so we need to know how to treat and handle these patients. After that came photorefractive keratectomy with PRK. Then, of course, there's LASIK and the most recent SMILE. So let's first talk about RK, which is radial keratotomy, which is an incisional surgery. So in radial keratotomy, radial incisions are made over the cornea in the periphery, 4 to 8 in number, sometimes a little more based on the myopia, and they have an optical zone of 3 mm or more. So it alters the corneal shape so that it is flatter in the center and steeper in the periphery, thereby correcting the myopic refractive error for such patients. And it completely went out of vogue, as we all know, because of the multiple complications like epithelial inclusion cysts, ectasias, epithelial downgrowths, and the most common of them all was the progressive hyperopic shift, often associated with a lot of astigmatism. So we moved on then to excimer laser based procedures. Now it's important to understand that the excimer laser is an ultraviolet light. It is of the wavelength 193 nanometers, and what it does is it breaks the inter and intramolecular bonds within the corneal stroma. Each molecule, each bond that is broken releases molecules which explode away from the surface but produce very less collateral damage. This is called photoablation. Now, the basis of laser treatments was on shifting the focal point of the eye. So, in a myopic eye, you have a slightly longer eyeball. The axial length is more than normal. So, as we know, the light rays converge in front of the retina versus the hyperopic eye where the light rays converge behind the retina. So, in a laser treatment, we are ablating the cornea in a myopic patient as seen on the left. The ablation is central, causing central flattening, pushing the focal point, which in this myopic patient was originally focusing in front of the retina, forcing it to be focused on the retina. Conversely, in hyperopia, we do a mid-peripheral ablation so that the center is spared and the center becomes more steep, thus pushing forward or bringing forward the focal point onto the retina of these patients. Now, in these lasers, there were different types of lasers. So the older variety was the broad beam laser, where there is a diaphragm or a pre-shaped ablatable mask through which that laser beam is passing. So this diaphragm or this aperture is passing over the cornea, and it allows an ablation such that there is more ablation in the center than in the mid periphery. Then came the scanning slit laser, which is very similar to a slit beam which is moving across the cornea, again allowing the center to be ablated more than the periphery. And the most recent or the better of all of them is the flying spot scanning laser, where a small laser beam is moving all across the cornea in a predetermined computer driven pattern. So it creates a more customizable laser pattern. The advantages of this were that there is increased flexibility, the profile can be altered, the mid-peripheral cornea also can be treated with laser as opposed to a lot of the previous lasers. And like I already mentioned, it allows a customized ablation unique for every cornea. The ultimate aim of every procedure is to produce an aspheric ablation so that your asphericity of the cornea is maintained. Now moving on to the next procedure, which was PRK or photorefractive keratectomy. So in this, the first step is just a plain and simple epithelium removal. Now we know that the epithelium is approximately 50 microns. So since the first step only involves a 50 micron removal followed by an excimer laser ablation of the stroma, this spares us a lot of tissue as compared to a LASIK where a flap is made and you have a flap of typically 100 to 120 microns. So you have saved almost 70 microns. So this procedure is preferred for patients who have borderline corneas, especially where you don't want to make a flap. And the epithelium removal, like I mentioned, is followed by the excimer laser stromal ablation. Complications of PRK are known to all. The most important is like because you have created an epithelial defect, so you will obviously get that much postoperative pain. Then there comes the risk of having an epithelial defect that you have created iatrogenically, which is delayed reepithelialization. There may be under or over corrections, and of course, corneal infiltrates because you have an induced epithelial defect. The most dreaded complication, I think, for all of us is post PRK haze. And the risk factors for that are usually a higher ablation depth, a larger ablation zone, history of oral contraceptive use, previous viral infections because apparently they reactivate after the ablation process, but this holds true for any excimer laser procedure, and ocular surface disorders. When should we use mitomycin C and why? So in order to prevent this haze, we try to use a mitomycin C along with our PRK. It is used in a concentration of 0.2 mg per ml. All right. Next we come on to LASIK, which is in two broad categories, microkeratome as well as femtosecond LASIK. So why did LASIK score over PRK? First and foremost, because there is no epithelial defect, the recovery is much faster, there is lesser postoperative pain, and the dreaded complication of haze is not existent in this procedure. So flap creation can be done in two ways: microkeratome based, which is a mechanical motorized blade which sits on the cornea and cuts through it or slices through it, or otherwise a femtosecond laser. So let's look at the microkeratome LASIK. So there are different parts of the microkeratome and you have to assemble it based on different types of companies that are there. You or your user comfort level, you can either assemble everything and then mount it onto the cornea, or you do a step-by-step assembly. First engage the suction ring and then the console over the cornea. So what are the steps of microkeratome LASIK? Now, first and foremost, what you need to do before you start any procedure is look at the patient. It's very important to see the width of their palpebral aperture so that you can accordingly also get a mental preparation of what or how you are going to handle the case, because you want adequate scleral exposure once you have opened the eye. Once that is done, you make sure that the suction ring as shown in the picture is well centered around the cornea. So your limbal view on all 360 degrees should be almost equal. Once you have pressed it, you wait till the suction is achieved. Now, whether your suction is achieved or not, there are three ways. There are certain machines which will tell you that your suction has been attained. Number two is you can see the value or the numerical value of the suction that is achieved for you to know that it is adequate. Number three is you test it with a Baracus tonometer. And number four is you digitally test it by pressing it with your own finger. You mount the microkeratome head after this if it's not already mounted. In some places, like I said, the suction ring is mounted and there's a microkeratome head right at the side, at the temporal aspect or the superior aspect, based on where you're making the flap. And then make the forward pass of the blade. You always cut wet and ablate dry. So while you're cutting, irrigate the cornea. Then comes the backward pass of the microkeratome. And after that, you either disengage suction yourself, or there, like I said, there are programs on the microkeratome where you can auto disengage the suction once there is a backward pass. Opposed to this, there is a flap creation with a femtosecond laser. Can this video be seen?
Yes, ma'am, very much.
Okay. So this is after the femtosecond laser, after the head has been docked over the cornea, the femtosecond laser is creating a flap. It first creates a canal, which you can see in the lower part of the picture, which is to allow air bubbles and gas to escape. The gas being the gas that has been generated by a cut through the cornea. I don't know why the entire video is not playing. Okay. After that, your flap has been created. Now you are going to go ahead for a flap lift. Now, the main difference between the two procedures, apart from the fact that your flap creation has been different, is also in the flap lift. A femtosecond flap lift is slightly tighter. So you first open up that gap and then lift it up in totality, as opposed to a microkeratome flap, which is quite a smooth lift. It's very easy to lift it up. After that, you of course pull back the flap on the side. I always like to protect the hinge no matter what. Make sure that you have mopped any residual liquid that's there in the hinge and then ablate the stromal bed. Now coming to the complications of LASIK, we all know about epithelial ingrowths, interface deposits. These can be seen more with microkeratome LASIK, and they're usually related to metallic debris which come from the vibration or the oscillation of the blade itself when it is making the forward pass. Alternately, these interface debris may come from the irrigating solution that you are using. Third, there are flap displacements. We don't usually see them unless the patient has vigorously squeezed or rubbed their eyes. That is why it's very important that after the procedure also you make the patient wait and see the patient again on slit lamp before you have discharged your patient. And of course, there is DLK or diffuse lamellar keratitis, which has to be treated appropriately with steroids. Now, the most dreaded complication of LASIK would definitely be a post-LASIK ectasia. So there is something called a Randleman's ectasia scoring. It's important for everyone to know this scoring. The scoring is based on 5 points. One is an abnormal topography. Two is a low residual stromal thickness. The residual stromal thickness, or RST, is something that we always want to keep above to 80 microns. A lot of practitioners like to keep their cutoff as 300. That's third is young age. So the younger the age group of the person being operated, there is more likelihood of ectasia. Low preoperative corneal thickness to begin with, and high myopia. Based on that, each you have to give a scoring. If you score 0 to 2 points, it is low risk, 3 points is moderate risk, and 4 points is high risk. On the basis of this ectasia scoring system, you even at a PG level can decide whether or not this patient is fit for LASIK or not. And last but not the least, we come to the most recent advancement, which is SMILE. So SMILE surgery is mainly the fact that we have no flap and no ablation. So we are going to use a femtosecond laser itself, but it's going to create a lenticule within the stroma that you're going to remove through a very small incision. So the superficial cornea is intact. Because of this, you have replaced the entire circumference of the LASIK cut that you are taking, and you have replaced 20 mm of circumference to 4 mm incision. So lesser cornea that is cut, lesser nerves that are damaged. Because of that, okay, we'll come to that later. Now, in the flap creation, it's very important to know the steps in which this cut is created. So if you see on the left in the diagram, I've mentioned 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first cut is the under surface or the bottom surface of the lenticule. After that comes the side cut. Then comes the cap cut. And the last is the opening incision. Why is this important for you to know? Is because if you create your superficial cut first, the femtosecond laser will not be able to pass to the deeper layers. So the bottommost cut is created first. The video on the right demonstrates the same. Let's just go through it again. So this is the first cut. Going from out to in is the under surface. After that, we're making the side cut. Then we are doing the over surface, and this extends for slightly beyond the under surface. So now you have a disc shaped lenticule that has been created. And then the last is inferiorly, you can see the small 4 mm incision. You enter, you dissect both the planes, superior as well as inferior. And then after that, you remove it. Okay. Disadvantages of SMILE: hyperopia cannot really be treated very well with it. In myopia also, there is a limit of not treating beyond -10 diopters, but there are most practitioners believe that beyond 8 also is a little questionable. There is no iris registration and hence does not account for cyclotorsion. Complications after SMILE. So SMILE, just because it's the most recent procedure, does not mean that it did not come with any complications. It also has its own complications, and there are enough and more reports of ectasia even after SMILE. If you have a regression or a residual refractive error after your SMILE procedure, you can go ahead with either a PRK, where you're just going to shave off the epithelium and go ahead with the ablation, or you can convert into a LASIK. So how do you convert into a LASIK? You can use a microkeratome to cut through this, or there is now something called a Circle software, which will help you convert your the SMILE lenticule area that you had cut into a flap. The advantages, like I was discussing, are there is no flap related complication. So there is no expectation of any flap dislodgement or any non-placement of flap, tearing of the flap, etc. The most important factor is that because there is no actual cut through the cornea, the proposed hypothesis is that the biomechanics of the cornea are preserved. So lesser effect on corneal strength. Since you have a smaller cut, so you have lesser damage to the corneal nerves. Since lesser corneal nerves are damaged, so lesser dry eye issues as compared to a LASIK. And because only one laser is used, the procedure is relatively quicker and slightly simpler than LASIK. LASIK does have a lot of manual arrangements that you have to do on the cornea in order for it to go well off, and it's there's a lot of surgeon induced factor like making sure that it's well centered, suction is achieved, etc., to carry it out. So let's see the differences between LASIK versus SMILE. So in LASIK, your pulse width is more than 500 femtoseconds. You have a spot size that is more than 1 micron, a repetition rate 60 to 150 kilohertz. You people can take a image of this slide because it might be a theory question for postgraduate level. Pulse energy is slightly on the lower side, and operation speed, very important, is between 8 to 30 seconds, as opposed to smile on the right side, which has a pulse width of much lesser. So there's only 220 to 580 femtoseconds, a spot size of around 1 micron, a repetition rate which is very high because you're cutting through the cornea, so 200 kilohertz. Pulse energy is almost the same, less than 1 microjoule, and a operation speed which is between 20 to 60 seconds, so slightly longer. Lastly, we come on to phakic IOLs. So after we are done with all our corneal procedures, we come on to our lenticular based or lens based procedures. In this, there is phakic IOLs. There are different types of phakic IOLs. So one would be your angle fixated phakic IOLs, iris supported, and posterior chamber, of which we know that we are all commonly using the posterior chamber phakic IOLs. So the angle fixated, as the name suggests, they stay in contact with the peripheral iris and the angle structures in the anterior chamber. Because of this, of course, they don't, because it's rubbing against the angular structures, there'll be that much pigment disturbance, dispersion, as well as disruption of the angle structures. So it's not an ideal situation. Then they came with iris supported lenses. These are basically an iris claw lens which is anteriorly fixed, but because it's fixed onto the iris, there may be acute and recurrent iritis, there may be ischemic iris atrophy on the area that it's clipped onto, there may be pupillary distortion, endothelial cell loss, secondary glaucoma, and CME also has been reported. So now we come to what we are now using for the higher refractive errors, which is the posterior chamber phakic IOLs. In this, it is an inert material which is bolted between the posterior pigmented layer of the iris and the anterior crystalline lens. Because it is very much dependent on the anterior zonular strength, it's very important that you assess these patients when they are fully dilated. So even in a crowded OPD, you can't say that the patient is semi-dilated, so you saw him and you let him go. You will have to see him fully dilated. So you have ensured that you have made, there is no phacodonesis, so that you are going to be putting a lens on the crystalline lens. You have to be doubly sure. Again, this doesn't come without its own side effects. The commonly known side effects are, or adverse effects are, angle closure glaucoma, cataract if it comes in touch with your crystalline lens, pigment dispersion because it may be rubbing anteriorly to the posterior pigmented layer of the iris. There may be dislocation of the IOL, cyclitis because it is in that area lodged over there, chronic uveitis, and macular edema. So let's talk about this implantable Collamer lens. It is made of a highly biocompatible collagen copolymer, which has a good refractive index of 1.45. There are powers ranging from 2 to 20 diopters of myopia and 1 to 10 diopters of hyperopia, with toric versions available up to 6 diopters of astigmatism. Now, who are the suitable candidates for phakic IOLs? Most important, not just for phakic IOLs, but for any patient who you are planning a refractive surgery for, you need to have a stable refraction. Stable meaning not more than 0.5 diopters of difference in reading for at least 1 year. I think this would be a golden rule for any refractive procedure. Your age group would be 21 to 45 years, particularly for phakic IOLs. Why? Because after that, they're anyways going to develop presbyopia, so at least you have to inform them about that. Also, because after that, they are going to become older and then develop chances of cataract. Anyways, high myopia has slightly early risk of getting cataract. AC depth, very important. From the endothelium, the anterior chamber depth should be 2.8 millimeters or more. So on whatever modality you have tested the AC depth, you have to calculate the AC depth from endothelium. That is very important. A good specular microscopy, is this a must? That is a debatable topic, but in most practices we do a specular microscopy before planning a ICL. and open angles. So we also do a gonioscopy to make sure that the angles are open before you plan a ICL. Now, there is a need to make an iridotomy, although the new design of the ICL itself has apertures or holes in it, as well as a central aperture, which is called a centraflow technology. But still, there are practitioners who like to do iridotomies either before the procedure or during the procedure. So, if you are planning an iridotomy prior to the procedure, it's usually a YAG laser which we do, and we do two openings just to make sure that if one shuts down, then the other remains patent. Alternately, if you are performing an iridotomy on table, it is a common practice for a lot of people after they have put in the ICL to inject pilocarpine so that the pupil constricts, and then they go in with the vitrectomy cutter far into the periphery, and at a very slow cut rate pinch up the iris in the periphery and cut through it to create a iridotomy which is slightly larger than what you would get in a YAG laser. Now, what is most important for us after we have performed an ICL is to look for the volt. So what you are going to assess in your patient of ICL after he comes for a post-operative follow-up is an ASOCT. In the ASOCT, you are going to see the ICL which is resting on the crystalline lens, and I've marked an arrow to show you the volt. The volt is the area between the posterior surface of the ICL and the anterior surface of the crystalline lens. A normal volt is anywhere between 350 to 800, but your ideal is of course 500 to 600 microns. So basically, when you are assessing it on slit lamp, you are going to compare it to your corneal thickness, because your corneal thickness is also usually between 500 to 600. So same amount of corneal thickness versus same amount of volt of the ICL should be there, is what you will clinically assess on a slit lamp, but you need to confirm this on an OCT as well. Parameters for ICL sizing are required when you are planning the ICL. There are two main parameters. One is your anterior chamber depth and one is your wide to wide. So if you have something like an IOL master, then you can directly get your anterior chamber depth. You need to make sure that the setting over here is AC depth from endothelium. Usually it will be epithelium. So you can deduct your corneal thickness from it so that you get AC depth from endothelium. And it will also give you a wide to wide. It's important to take 3 readings of both. If you have an OBSCAN, which in the current day is very rare to see, but the OBSCAN wide to wide studies have shown that it is very much more reliable than any of the other wide to wides. And what if you don't have an IOL master? Then the wide to wide can be taken manually. So there are digital calipers that you can get, and you can do a manual measurement. Always take 3 readings and take the average of that. Based on that, there is a calculation, and then you have to select the ICL size that you are planning. So what are the advantages of this? It allows the crystalline lens to retain its function. It induces, of course, much lesser spherical aberrations because you're not touching the cornea at all. The lens is removable and exchangeable. So God forbid, if you feel that the IOP is spiking and it's not coming under control or any such situation, then you can always remove it. The result is predictable and immediately stable because of the fact that you are just making one incision similar to a cataract, going in, injecting this and coming out. Your healing process is much lesser, so the recovery is faster. Also very important, it's placed very close to the nodal point of the eye. So the effective optic zone of the phakic IOL is much more because you are not on the cornea, which is away from the lens. You are just next to the lens, which is very close to the nodal point. Like all procedures, it has its own complications. Like I said, endothelial cell loss has been documented. So it's important to do a specular. Cataracts, especially if you have got an anterior crystalline touch, anterior uveitis, secondary glaucoma, displacement of the IOL, decentration, and pigment dispersion with lens deposits. Moving on, we come to refractive surgeries for presbyopia. So usually we said 21 to 45 is the age group that we are looking even for an ICL. But nowadays we have people in the presbyopic age group also who are equally interested in spectacle independence. So what can we do for them? There are two types of procedures that we can do. One is again corneal and the other is lens-based. In the corneal procedures, we have monovision, press-beyond LASIK, and corneal inlays. In lens-based procedures, we have again ICL, which we can reserve for those who have very high refractive errors, or otherwise refractive lens exchange, after which you can put a multifocal, accommodative, or a trifocal lens. So what is monovision? In monovision, basically, we are going to treat one eye for distance and one eye for near. So you are going to first check which is the dominant eye. After you have done this, the dominant eye is going to be corrected for distance, meaning your dominant eye is going to be targeted at plano, and your near eye is going to be corrected to myopia, which can range from 1.5 to 3 diopters. So though the classic definition of monovision is to have the near vision in the other eye as minus 3 diopters, there are a lot of people who believe that it will cause too much of diplopia. So even as much as 1.5 diopters of difference is considered as monovision. Anything lesser than that would be what we quantify as micro or mini monovision. Now, what's very important if you are planning a monovision for any patient is that it's important to show them what they might experience. So a person like me will usually in the OPD itself, while examining or while offering this to the patient, we will put it in the trial frame and give it to them so that they understand. It's very important for them to understand that from one eye, when they are seeing distance, they will not see near from that eye. Why is this important? Because after the procedure gets over, they say ये आंख से दूर का दिखता है but नजदीक का नहीं दिखता है. That is obvious, but they may not have registered that prior to the procedure. So it's important to sit and again chair time, explain to them that this is what is going to be. One eye for distance, one eye for near, but since in your normal working life both eyes are going to be open, you're going to have the best of both worlds. Second important thing to explain to monovision patients is that very fine print may not be very clear to those who have visually demanding tasks. So if you have an IT professional for whom you are doing this, he's going to be unhappy in a few years again because his presbyopia is going to worsen and he's again going to need glasses. Very important to explain these points to the patient. In terms of procedure options, you also have the camera inlay, which we are not doing anymore. Basically, it has the pinhole camera effect. So it is a corneal insert and it acts like a pinhole extending the natural range of vision. This inlay is always implanted in the non-dominant eye for the same effect, that one eye is treated for distance and the other eye will have the camera inlay which helps them focus for near. On the other hand, you have corneal procedures or laser-based procedures like press-beyond or supracor. These lasers are something called blended lasers where they have different zones of ablation on the cornea so that it changes the curvature of the cornea so that the central part is facilitated for near vision and the mid periphery and periphery are for distance. And lastly, we have our refractive lens exchange, which can be a clear lens exchange as well. So in these patients, you can offer them a multifocal, which may be a bi or a trifocal. Now with the fact that trifocal lenses are easily available, that should be your best option that you offer to the patient. What we need to know is the option of bioptics, where you can do a refractive surgery. You can do an IOL followed a phakic IOL followed by a LASIK so that you increase the range of your treatment. Because in phakic IOL, the FDA approval is for 22 diopters. You can always make a customized lens for a higher power, but this is the FDA approval. So if you want to broaden the spectrum for even higher myopes like 30 and 35 diopters, then you can combine these two procedures, of course, providing their cornea also is optimal. Now, as a last, I have 3 cases to help you decide what procedure would you choose. So case 1 is a 28-year-old male, refraction in both eyes is -3 diopters, and he's a boxer by profession. So in this case, we would like to not have a flap because of the risk of flap dislodgement and displacement and flap related complications. So in this situation, we would either like to opt for a PRK or a smile. At the end of the presentation, I'd like to put this question to Dr. Hijab, whether smile is okay for these kind of professions. Though theoretically it seems to be okay because we don't have a flap. Case number 2 is a 22-year-old female with a refractive error of -6.5 with -1 at 90. Her Schirmer's test is 7 and 6 mm at 5 minutes. She's a contact lens user and has hypothyroid on treatment. Assuming that everything else in the examination is normal, what procedure would you choose for this girl? So, first and foremost, the reason I have put up these values of Schirmer's test and contact lens is to make you realize that before you do any refractive procedure for this patient, you must always treat the dry eye, because the dry eye is going to worsen whatever you do with any refractive procedure. So you need to get up your ocular surface adaptability to the procedure, or prepare your eye for the procedure that is going to come up next. So you would want her to stop her contact lenses for at least 2 weeks. You would want her to put lubricating eye drops. You would want to check for any MGD or treat for MGD. Reassess her after that period of time. Make sure that her thyroid is under control and under check. Explain to her the possibility of dry eyes after the procedure as well, and then plan a procedure for her. Since she already has a slightly Schirmer test and low Schirmer test and hypothyroid, she is more predisposed to dry eye. So in this case, the obvious choice would be a smile procedure. Come to case 3. This is a 38-year-old male with a refraction of -13 with -1.5 at 180, and he's an IT professional. Now, quite obviously, we know that if it's such a high myope, and assuming, like I said, that everything else is normal, topography, pachymetry, and everything, we are going to plan a phakic IOL if the patient is willing. The second option for patients who cannot afford a phakic IOL would always be a LASIK with undercorrection. But for such patients who have a -13, if you undercorrect, you're going to leave back so much of a residue that the patient is not going to be really happy. So it's important to explain that to them as well. And more importantly is he's 38-year-old. He is going to develop presbyopia very soon. Because of that presbyopia, he's going to need glasses for reading as well, and that glasses number is going to be increasing. So it's very important to explain presbyopia to these patients who are just pre-presbyopic. Because he's a very high myope, you also have to do a detailed peripheral fundus evaluation, ideally with indentation. And in this particular case, I've mentioned an astigmatism of 1.5 diopters. Now, in our ICLs, we usually start, the toricity of the lens starts with 2 diopters. So, which means that even if you sit temporally, you are going to have a certain amount of residual astigmatism, which may compromise their ultimate or final visual acuity. This again has to be explained to the patient. Usually they will be very happy because they have come down from -13 diopters to almost negligible. But it's important to explain because they may not be able to read that last line. They may not be able to read the finer print, which other people may be able to read. And ultimately, it's all about counseling your patients. So the take home message from the presentation should be that refractive surgery has to be individualized. You should know which patient to choose and which patient to reject. And always, 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 golden rule is that you have to under promise and over deliver. Thank you. I think we have enough time for questions now.
That was very good, Karishma. You managed to cover so much in half an hour. So I think that was a very good comprehensive talk for the PGs.
Thank you, ma'am.
There are some questions also.
Yeah.
Maybe you can give the first question. They wanted to know what is the depth of the lenticule for when you're doing smile.
So I think you can take that.
Yeah. So when you're doing smile, you can decide that at what depth you want to create the lenticule depending on how much refractive error you're correcting and what is the patient's corneal thickness. So if the patient's corneal thickness is good and the refractive error is under 6 and all, what is recommended by the company is that you make a cap. That is called cap. The cap thickness is 120 microns. It is equivalent to the flap thickness, like with the microkeratome LASIK or femto LASIK, where you make a flap of 100 microns, 110 microns, 120 microns. So that way you determine the cap thickness and smile. Below that cap, the lenticule is created. So if you're going to correct a high refractive error, something like 7, 8, 9, then you would want to keep the cap thickness a little lower. Maybe you could go as low as 100, though I have not gone as low as 100. I have gone as low as 105. And there's something also known as a base thickness. So whatever the lenticule thickness, in addition, there's some base thickness which is cut along with the lenticule, just to ease the handling of the lenticule, because otherwise extracting the lenticule will become difficult. So you keep, that's where the lenticule is created, anywhere between 100 to 120. And the next question is, what is the residual bed thickness in LASIK? So again, the residual bed thickness, as Dr. Karishma said, 280, though everybody would have their own cutoff. Some people are okay with 280 residual bed thickness. My personal preference is at least 300 microns bed thickness. I don't mind undercorrecting the patient, but the residual bed thickness should be at least 300 microns.
So I'd like to add here that there is also one more factor that a lot of people take into account, which PGs should know, is the ablation depth. So when you have entered your refractive error into your machine, your ablation depth, a lot of us don't like to cross beyond 100 or 110 microns, even if you have an adequate residual stromal bed. So that's another thing that you need to keep in mind.
Then what is the other question?
Smile. After how many days post-smile refraction is stabilized? And in case of patient having a residual refractive error, after how many days we can redo a refractive surgery? And can we redo a smile?
Redo smile, not yet. You can't redo a smile, not yet, but maybe in the near future we may be able to redo. And the refraction stabilizes immediately. There are patients immediately first day post-op who are seeing 6/6, 6/5, but they may complain of the quality of vision, which usually stabilizes in a week to a month. And for retreatment following smile would be like LASIK or PRK. You wait at least for a month. Suppose that the patient complains that I'm seeing blurred in one eye, you ask them not to keep comparing both the eyes, let them see with both eyes together and wait for a month. After a month, you can ascertain the refraction. And if you feel that, okay, it's something like anything up to minus 0.5 sphere cylinder, patients are really seeing 6 parts and you don't really need to do a retreatment for that. More than that, minus 0.75 and above that, you wait for the refraction to stabilize. You should get the same refraction 2 consecutive visits at least a month apart. That is the time you would go ahead and retreat after smile. And retreatment after smile, as Dr. Karishma said, either it would be a PRK. If it's just a minus 0.75, you can do a PRK. Or you can also, now there's the circle software which Zeiss is giving, and you convert that cap into a flap, lift the flap, and then you will do a femto LASIK kind of a thing. So if you don't mind sacrificing the integrity and converting cap to flap, you do that, or you do a PRK. So not before 1 month, and preferably 2 months, 3 months, depending on when the refraction stabilizes. Next question is,
how to know which is the dominant eye? This was in view of monovision that ma'am was explaining.
maybe Karishma?
So yeah, we hold, usually what we do in the OPD is you take a square piece of paper, so you can cut it into a square, draw the 2 diagonals, and the center point where the both diagonals meet, you make a hole with your own pen. So you can do this by yourself in your OPD. You can do it at home and check your own ocular dominance. You make the hole and you hold it in the center of your face at your arm's length. So the hole is not going to be, or the pinhole that you have created is not going to be on the side giving one eye any preference. It's going to be centered on your nasal bridge in between both your eyes. And then you close one eye and then the other eye, and you see through which eye you are able to focus at the distance visual acuity chart. So predominantly, as we all know, that ocular dominance is more in the right eye is 80% and left eye is 20%, but it may be the other way as well. And yeah, so that's how you check for dominance while you're evaluating your own patient.
What is the other question? Since
just a minute.
which is the preferred lubricant?
Before that, there are many, ma'am.
Acha.
Yeah, madam. Preferred lubricant in post-cataract versus post-LASIK versus post-PRK versus all those options which I have written.
Okay, so before that, please tell the
Yeah.
students about percentage tissue altered in LASIK. Okay, so normally when you're doing LASIK, when you want to decide how much to correct and what is the refractive error, what is the pachymetry, flap thickness, so all these things when you want to decide, there is metric called percentage tissue altered, which is actually plus the flap thickness divided by the corneal thickness of the patient. So that is the percentage tissue altered. It should be less than 40%. Anything more than 40% means you're going to push the cornea towards ectasia. And also remember, the minimum pachymetry recommended is 500 microns prior to LASIK. Anything below that, not recommended to create a flap or a cap if the patient's refractive error is low, something like 4, 5, even up to 6. Would go, this is debatable. There will be surgeons who will want to make a flap and do a LASIK or do a smile, but my personal cutoff is now 500. Anything below 500, I go for PRK, and over 500, it will be LASIK or smile. So unfortunately, smile also, the cutoff is same like LASIK. And
I agree with Dr. Hijab. I feel that it's important for the PGs to understand that this is a very big gray zone. And
correct.
In actual practice, every practitioner will have their own cutoffs, but I have a similar cutoff to what Dr. Hijab mentioned.
And nowadays, PRK has come back in a big way. It's not like an outdated procedure. PRK, many earlier, like when PRK came, you had the broad beam lasers, as Dr. Karishma said. So the ablation profiles were not very smooth. The corneal surface after ablation was not as smooth as what it is today with the flying spot lasers. So that is one of the reasons why PRK healing, post PRK healing is a lot better now than what it was earlier. And of course, now that we're applying mitomycin C and managing the patients a lot better, we know now what are the factors which are haze producing. So among one of the factors which produces haze, there are certain lasers which are haze producing. The broad beam lasers, the variable spot lasers, the scanning slit lasers, which could predispose to haze because the ablation profile is not as smooth as the flying spot lasers. Karishma, you can talk about the lubricant, I think.
So the lubricant eye drops usually that I would prefer in any patient of LASIK post surgery. Ideally, you should want something that is preservative free in either case. But I personally use a CMC based drop, and I keep the lubricating eye drop on for the next 2 to 3 months. This is very important to explain to the patient the importance of that lubricating eye drop for such a long period, because most of them think that they are all comfortable within the first week. So they think that after a few days or after a few weeks, they become lazy and the patient compliance goes down. So it's important to explain to them that because we have made a cut in your cornea to create that LASIK flap, we are inducing a certain amount of dryness, and it's going to take a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks for you to get back to your normal levels of tear production, which is why this is a supplementary treatment till you get back to your normal levels. So I use CMC as a personal choice. Is there any varied opinion, ma'am? What do you use?
No, whichever, like.
Yeah, I don't think it really
use
matters.
CMC, HPMC.
Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Not neither in
combination
cataract nor in LASIK. I think it doesn't.
Yeah. It's fine. Depending on the dry eye status, either you can use the 0.5%, 1%.
Or a 1%, yes.
Yeah, you use the gel formulation at bedtime.
So I do add a gel formulation or an ointment-based formulation for patients of PRK. That's because they anyways tend to have more dry eyes.
More
If
dry
that is
eyes,
the
that's
question that they were asking.
Yeah. Then what else is there?
There is one more question from Dr. Monish that all these phakic IOL patients, when they do develop a cataract, a senile cataract later on, so what complications can we anticipate because of the primary procedure of phakic IOL being done?
Actually, nothing. That lens doesn't stick
You
there.
just
So
remove
it
it
is
and
quite,
throw it.
yeah, it comes out quite easily. And even the IOL power calculation is not a problem, because whichever, if you're using master or the lens star or the ultrasound, they pass through very easily through the phakic IOL. So there's no problem even in the IOL power calculation. It is very much the same.
Only thing, ma'am, the we will not be able to do femto in such cases, correct?
Actually, you may be able. I haven't done a femto, but I don't see. I just read somewhere or heard somebody say that they have done a femto also, because that lens is clear. No, the phakic IOL per se is clear, so the femto laser will pass through the phakic IOL. Maybe if Dr. Nagwekar is there, he could answer that question. Has he done something like that? Has he done a femto post phakic?
For a post-phakic IOL.
For a post phakic IOL, I think it can be done, because that laser will allow the femto.
Absolutely.
Dr. Nagwekar, sir?
Yeah, it can be easily done. I have done it already.
Shabash.
Yeah, it's very clear, because the thing is clear, and the main advantage of the femto is that you have a live OCT, so you can adjust the markers very clearly, and you can get a very nice rexus on the anterior capsule. No problem at all.
Okay.
Thank you.
One more question to Karishma ma'am here. Ma'am, this is little theoretical, but because most of the audience here is PGs, the DLK is the one of the important short note that they keep on asking both in DNB and MS. So can you just enlighten them the practical points?
Okay, so first of all, there can be two presentations of it. It can either come early, that means on first post-op day itself you will see DLK, or it may even present later. What's important for you to know when you see a DLK is that it is an immune response. So you will need to give some amount of steroid. Okay. Now, when you see it clinically, even if it is a small amount of DLK, you need to act immediately. So there you all must be knowing the grades of DLK 1, 2, 3, and 4, where you have sands of Sahara, where the entire cornea is filled with the immune infiltrates which are in the interface. Now, if you have a mild grade, usually what we see on slit lamp on the first day is, especially in the mid periphery, you commonly see these small yellowish white stromal kind of cellular appearance, and you will need to start steroid based on how vigilant you want to be. You can either start a steroid 1 hourly or 2 hourly. I usually like to use prednisolone for patients of DLK. If you have a grade, so 1 to 2 is what you would treat with steroid. If you are having a grade 3, then you would usually want to enter and lift the flap and wash it. Okay. What is in grade 4 also, again, if you're having an immediate presentation with grade 4, then you are going to have to lift it and wash it immediately along with your steroids. There are reports of also giving oral steroids, but I think it's more about the locally acting medication topically that works. Also, when the DLK is clearing, it starts clearing from the periphery to the center. So as the days progress, the yellowish appearance of the sandy appearance will start getting whiter, and the infiltrates will consolidate. You should not go into a panic for that situation, because that is a sign that the DLK is resolving. The cells are coming closer to the center. A lot of these patients develop what is called CTK, or central toxic keratopathy, where there is a disc shaped infiltrate right bang on in the center or in the entire cornea. The most important thing that you need to know about a CTK is that it is self limiting. So even though you will give steroid, though reports say that the role of steroid is questionable, you will still give it, because clinically everyone is going to go into a panic situation. So we give steroid, but it resolves over a long period, even of up to 6 months. So in a patient of CTK, the only thing you're going to do is wait and wait and wait some more till you are absolutely sure that the CTK causing the haze or causing the opacity has totally gone or left back with some residue which you can treat later on.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Karishma. And
Most
thank you, Ijab ma'am. And
Thank you.
one last question, just for the definition, because they might be asked this question in Viva, is what is the exact difference between regression and ectasia post-LASIK?
So regression would be the reappearance of a refractive error which is not associated with any ectatic changes in the cornea, which means there is no further thinning of the cornea, there is no evidence of ectasia. Your thickness of the cornea will most probably remain the same whatever it was after your surgery. So this is another practice. It's a good point that has been brought up. So there is a lot of us as clinicians who like to do an optical biometry for patients who we plan a LASIK for, and we like to give that to the patient to keep that as their records, so that we can help it can help in the calculation of IOL power post LASIK. That is, whenever they develop the cataract later in life, these values may help us. Of course, we can calculate the powers even without it, but it just adds to the value added benefit. And the second thing is that when you are so yeah, has that answered the question? Sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
So yeah, we like to give it to the patient so that we do the optical biometry so that the patient's records are with them of what their axial length and their corneal curvature was prior to the surgery. So yeah, sorry, you were talking about regression versus ectasia. Ectasia, I think there's nothing to, it's ectasia, it's corneal thinning along with increase in the curvature. So
Is it
Development of irregular corneal astigmatism.
irregular, yeah,
Yeah.
and
basically
time period
the-
probably the time period post 3 months you would suspect more of ectasia, and early
Actually, time period, ectasia can occur 10 years after LASIK also, and
yeah
regression also can occur 10 years after LASIK. So
okay
I don't really think time is important. It is the irregular astigmatism along with corneal thinning and ectasia, which is progressive over a period of time, like that. And regression, once it occurs, most time, no, I have seen regression also progressing over a period of time, but the cornea is normal. The corneal topography is normal and the astigmatism, myopia, whatever is regular. So regular astigmatism.
It will just be a return of a regular refractive error, which will not be associated with, like she said, any irregular astigmatism
so
or any
repeated
topographic
topography
changes.
repeated topography is important.
Yes, repeat topography is important to pick up ectasia. That's right.
Sumit, any
Yeah,
questions?
there are two more questions that have been come up. What is the ideal IOL power calculation post PRK, post LASIK, as they have flat cornea? So, what is the preferred choice that you all use, ma'am?
So what I personally do is that I use something called the ASCRS online calculator for calculating IOL power post refractive surgery. The reason I use this in conjunction with the Barrett's calculator is that it uses all the formula that are available for calculating post LASIK IOL power, and it gives you the various values that you can choose from. So it will take into consideration your pre-LASIK refractive error, pre-LASIK topography, your post-LASIK stable refraction, which is very important again. So post-LASIK stable refraction is after 1 year, your stable refraction of that patient along with a stable topography is what you need to feed in there. That is pre or prior to the development of cataract. All these things need to be filled in that form, after which it will calculate for you, and it will show you each formula's value, and along with that it will give you a minimum, a maximum, and an average on the ASCRS platform. So once you have that average, what I usually do is we target 1 diopter of myopia from whatever average value we have got, because of the fact that there may be a subtle difference in the outcome as compared to planned. So you rather err in myopia than hyperopia. So I target a little more myopia when I'm choosing my IOL power, and the IOL power that I choose is the average value that has come on the ASCRS calculator. I match that with the Barrett's calculator just to be sure.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Hijab ma'am, want to add something, or this is fine?
What Karishma said is fine. That's maybe the ideal way to do, to go to the ASCRS platform and do. But I normally am slightly lazy to do that. So I just, I have a Lenstar. So I look at the Barrett's formula on Lenstar and the Sharma's no history formula on Lenstar. So if you're lazy, you can do that. If you have the IOL Master 700, then you can go to the Barrett's TrueK for
And the Haigis L.
calculation post LASIK. And those who don't have both can send their, if you're in Bombay, then you can send to Dr. Deepak Bhatt. He will do the IOL Master 700 for you and he'll give you.
Okay, I think that answers all the questions here. Except there is one question last, where Dr. Tuba ma'am, the case scenarios that you had shown in your presentation for the last last thing, they want to know that why can't we put toric or the multifocal in the last case scenario that you had shown?
Would you want to do a lens exchange for a 38-year-old? That's again a very controversial gray zone area, right? So it's the affordability of the patient also that will come into factor for every procedure that you do. Ultimately, it's about the affordability of the patient. So if the patient is non-affording for an ICL, though I think now the Indian ICLs, the Indian IPCL is quite in the affordable range. So I would not like to remove the lens unless absolutely necessary. That is my personal choice. Is Hijab ma'am, do you have a
No, and also the risk of a complication, if you do a clear lens, especially in high myopes, is the risk of RD and all is not theoretical. You can, I have seen my patients, not even young patients, old patients, over 60 and all, who were high myopes, whom we have done a cataract surgery, uneventful, they have come back with HST and RD and all. So the risk of RD is real in these high myopes. Even if they have a normal peripheral retina at the time of surgery, they are likely to develop HSTs later, some months down, because there's loss of this support to the vitreous base. Remove the clear lens and all. So personally, and also what is reported is somewhere about 9% risk of RD. Myopes more than -6 diopters who undergo clear lens extraction. A phakic IOL is definitely a better choice than clear lens extraction in myopes. Now, if it had been a 38-year-old with +6, a hydrope maybe at that age you can consider clear lens, but myopes better to avoid clear lens.
Okay, ma'am. So, with your permission, can we conclude the meeting, Hijab ma'am?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sumit. Thank you very much
thank
for
you.
inviting me. Thank you, Karishma.
Thank you,
And
Hijab.
Thank you.
thank you, all the audience, for logging in.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Swapnesh.
Thank you. Thank you.
We hope we've answered everyone.
Yes, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Any further questions, Karishma? I'll just mail you, then we'll
Sure.
put on the group.
All right.
Thank you, Hijab.
Thank you. Good night.
Sumit,
Thank
thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.